CEO of Catholic Charities for the Archdiocese of Denver, and he's also the Executive Director of Social Ministry for the Archdiocese of Denver. Jonathan taught history at Christendom College and served as its Vice President for Academic Affairs. Jonathan has also served as Vice President for Campus Ministry and Formation for the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, Focus. As I mentioned, he co-founded the Augustine Institute in 2005, and he was the first president. He studied at the University of Michigan and earned his PhD in European history at the University of Notre Dame. And so I'd like to invite Jonathan up for the next talk. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
The Catholic moment. The Catholic moment. Because I'm actually going to argue this evening that there's a moment in the history of the West, and in particular in the history of our country, that we should not fear primarily, but that we should see as an opportunity. Which is not how it feels. Let me tell you, being head of Catholic Charities lately, it doesn't feel like there's wonderful opportunities always. Since being head of Catholic Charities, since the HHS mandate, among other things, have been coming out, and since what would appear to be one of the more, certainly the more concentrated, if not dramatic, attacks on religious freedom, and in particular the Catholic expression of religion in our country, it's been a pretty tense time. A lot of questions, a lot of time at the Capitol, a lot of talking to lawyers, trying to figure out where things stand. And there's a temptation, because I do view this mandate and other things as existential threats to Catholic Charities. Can we continue to function? Can we continue to function the way we hope to? The good news is the church has always served the poor, and if Catholic Charities were closed tomorrow, because of the people in this room, the church would continue to serve the poor. We do it. Nonetheless, it's a real threat. And there's a temptation to do two kinds of reactions. The first reaction is just sheer panic. What is going on? What happened? 5 years ago, who could have ever imagined? Things seem so peaceful. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And there's some kind of fear that kicks in. And the fear can paralyze you or make you panicky. And so the second thing you want to do is, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And that's one of the things I hear the most of people ask me, what should we do? What should we do? Isn't this horrible? And as I reflected on this, and this is what sort of shaped my talk tonight, and I thought, the challenge we're in, the struggle we're in right now for a vision of humanity that's compatible with the Christian vision is a long-term struggle. And there's certain immediate things we need to do. There's certain immediate reactions. Yes, we need to call politicians. Yes, we need to sign petitions. Yes, we need to get active in any number of ways. And we'll talk about some of those at the end of the talk. But what I'm more and more convinced of, and why I wanted to put this in historical context, is because I want to say to you, I want to argue tonight, and you don't have to agree, that we're actually at a particular moment in a much longer struggle that's about 200 years old over the nature of humanity, frankly, in the West. And only when we understand that can we think about a strategy that's going to last beyond the next election cycle, or beyond the next mandate, or beyond the next fight down at the courthouse, or beyond the next Supreme Court decision. And I am convinced that to react wisely to our current challenge, we need more context. And so what I'd like to do tonight, as tempted as I am to just simply put my fist in the air and say, defend religious liberty and donate to Catholic Charities. See, notice I didn't say that? I think the most important thing right now is that we locate ourselves historically as Westerners and as Americans in a broader narrative of the development of the challenge to religious freedom, of which this current challenge is an episode and a certain manifestation. There's something larger going on. And so tonight I'd like to do some history. Now to do that, I need to cheat a little bit, or I need to condense a lot of information. So, as a historian, there's two great flaws of historians. We like to study the history in more detail than most human beings care to know about it. And we like to talk about history in more detail than most humans like to hear about it. So I've condensed a lot. And what I want to say is I've reduced the talk to basically what I'm calling 7 points or 7 snapshots. that I think will paint a picture and a narrative for us. In order to do that in the short amount of time we have, I have to condense a lot of information, and I have all kinds of bibliographic background and ways to back up things I have here, so feel free to ask questions later, ask for book lists or whatever. But I'm condensing a lot of information. And really what I'm doing is taking what should probably be 7 different talks, if not a course or two, and trying to put them in one talk. This is also, by the way, not an apologetic for religious liberty. I don't think I want to, tonight I don't think what we need is to defend religious liberty as a concept. There's some superb sources out there for that, and some people are doing that quite boldly. I thought the Special Ad Hoc Committee of the USCCB's summary, if you've read that, that came out in there, on religious freedom was actually a pretty nice, condensed, wonderful argument for why religious freedom. What I want to do is locate us. I want to locate us in this moment, and the end of the argument is going to be that this is a particular Catholic moment, one with challenge and no doubt one with grace. I feel a little bit like a hobbit, for those of you who know it. Frodo Baggins, for those of you who've read Lord of the Rings, for those of you who haven't, sorry. You're just not relevant. There's a great line that Frodo Baggins says. He's describing the Shire, and at one point he says, you know, I think it will be good for the Shire if a dragon occasionally visited here. And his point was because the hobbits are getting a little fat and a little lazy, because life is so easy. And if you were a hobbit, I know this is all made up, walk with me for a minute. And he created this wonderful thing called second breakfast. That's sort of the worldview of a hobbit. You have second breakfast, which is before pre-lunch, okay? And you sort of get the view, and the notion that a dragon showing up would somehow awake him. And I actually think maybe a dragon has shown up. Maybe a dragon has shown up in a way that gives us an opportunity to wake up. As Americans, as Catholics, as people of faith. And I hope that I can locate us, make sense of that statement as I go along. The immediate background for this talk, some of you well know. Let me just summarize a few things. In the words of the USCCB Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty, from their statement, Our First Most Cherished Liberty, they just listed a whole set of things that are happening at the same time. At the top of the list is the HHS mandate, which would require organizations against their conscience to provide contraceptive care coverage, to provide abortifacients, sterilization, and even if they don't pay for it, and many of you maybe followed that drama, it's still highly problematic. And they actually came up with another statement today on the compromise and why it's problematic. We've seen in the last few years state laws that impede even giving sacraments to undocumented people in the United States. State laws that would not even allow the church to give them the sacraments. We've seen the state legislators who have attempted to restructure Catholic parishes. This particular happened in Connecticut, and there was an effort to say that all Catholic parishes have to function basically like congregationalists, and they have to have a lay board. They can't report directly to the bishop. Part of that was also a redefinition of what a religious minister even is. We've seen the recent court case that got to the Supreme Court on Hosanna Tabor, which was actually over who gets to define what a religious minister is. And I'll have you know, this is actually, it seems striking and unprecedented. I'll bring some historical examples to bear, but from the time of the English Reformation to the French Revolution, through the events in Mexico in the 1920s, to Spain in the 1930s, the first thing you do as a government, if you want to make the church less effective, and by the way, the Romans knew this, Julian the Apostate knew this, make sure you get to define who gets to be a priest. If you can define that, you got them, because you got a hold of their leadership. So this is not a new tactic. We've seen the persecution of Christian groups on college campuses in California and in Vanderbilt, because of my local focus and dear friends involved in that. We've seen the restriction of funding for adoption and foster care services. We've seen restriction of funding for human trafficking with the USCCB, basically over issues of what a Catholic would call conscience issues, moral issues. In Denver itself, I won't bore you with the details, but we've experienced a certain version of it even on a small scale here at Catholic Charities. That's the immediate background. Extended just a bit, and efforts to curtail religious freedom have been going on in the United States for a number of years. I was just recently had the privilege of being in New York at the Becket Fund dinner. The Becket Fund is a nonprofit that was founded in order to defend religious liberty issues. And they were honoring their founder, so it's kind of neat. They had a video on all the things they've done, and they went back 15 years to cases 15 years ago where these sorts of things were popping up. So this is in one sense not new. What this has done, I believe, is put us as Catholics, as Americans, as Christians, as Westerners in a sort of moment of confusion and uncertainty. Where the heck do we stand? A fervor, certainly, a desire to be very active, but also a sense of, okay, how do we take stock of what the heck is going on? What is going on? And what I'd like to do is in 7 snapshots, give you a historical opinion, and I do say opinion, on where we are, where this has come from. Snapshot 1, for those of you taking notes. Titled it, The French Revolutionary Legacy. The French Revolution. In a certain sense, the religious liberty fight we're a part of is 200 and some years old in its modern manifestation. The French Revolution has been massively studied. It's one of my favorite topics. There's billions of books on it. I'm going to reduce it to a couple simple things. Most of us know from our school days, and maybe higher ed, that the French Revolution marked a political revolution. The king was beheaded, the States General was called, a new form of government was shaped. But the French Revolution was also an anthropological revolution. There was a change that came out of the French Revolution, in a much longer story that I won't tell, fundamentally about what a human being is. And this anthropological revolution had 2 basic premises, or 2 basic assertions. One, God is no longer relevant to human history. Humans make their own history. God has no place in it. And the second is that a human being is not sinful or fallen, but is in fact perfectible. Number 1, God has no place in human history. Number 2, human beings are perfectible. If there's any gaps in humans, it's because they're not intelligent enough, or they haven't learned enough, or they're not free enough yet. But if we just get over some of that stuff, we can not only have perfect humans, we can have a perfect society for them. And by the way, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, a number of writers during the French Revolution and after who actually believed a whole new world was a-borning. That something remarkable was happening, that we were pursuing human perfection, that with the change of a few laws and the right government structure and the releasing of a few freedoms, and yes, the suppression of Catholic faith, we could actually perfect the human race. So it had a whole other world. God is irrelevant. Human beings on their own can make a perfect world. One of the subtexts of that was, in order for humans to be able to perfect their own world, they need education and they need freedom. Freedom understood as the absence of any kind of constraint, period. No limits on human behavior in any way. It's worth noting the revolution was not complete. Not everyone agreed with that. France actually fought a number of wars, endured quite a history over this battle. But a lot of Americans don't know that the 19th century in Europe was largely a fight in the realm of ideas and on the battlefield over precisely the ideas that governed the French Revolution. We didn't see it because we were over here in the US and we had a different experience, which I'll talk about in a minute, where our ancestors were. Or our history teachers don't tell us about it. So there's this moment in human history when you might say, what I tell some of my students is the world changed its mind. Portions of it. And those ideas of human freedom, of God not being in history, of the perfectibility of the human race, of the need for freedom from all constraint, started gaining following and started becoming more prevalent. Interestingly enough, to just summarize these ideas, I'd like to actually quote Justice Anthony Kennedy in the famous Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision in 1992. Here's a vision of the world straight out of the ideas that led to the French Revolution. Quote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." End quote. Basically, you define your own existence in every way. That's maximized freedom, humans without sin, building the perfect world, if we can do that. Snapshot 2. The American exception. the American exception. Our history of this country, though influenced by some of the ideas that affected the French Revolution, nonetheless took a different course in its own founding. There's a lot of debate around the question of how Christian is the founding of the United States of America. There have been a lot of books and a lot of ink spilled on this. I think it's safe to say that in many ways the American founding was Christian, and in many ways it was sort of Enlightenment ideas like the French Revolution. It was both. That's why you can always quote a founding father defending one thing or the other. Jefferson was a deist. He took all the miracles out of the Bible. Yeah, he also talked about nature and nature's God. These kinds of things show up in our own founding. I think a simple way to put it is the American founding was sort of a Protestant and Enlightenment hybrid. There were two kinds of things going on in it. I think this is very important. And I think it's important because I don't know that it matters a whole lot whether it was purely Christian or not founding. It was two things. Here's the point. For most of our history in the United States, until recently, certain fundamental Christian assumptions that were part of the Protestant or even deist elements of our founding dominated. Certain ideas about what a human being is. Americans in the 19th century certainly believed in sin. Civil War was very much a religious war. If you read the Civil War debates, there's a tremendous, it's very interesting, fascinating, looking into why the North thought God was on their side and why the South thought God was on their side. That's how Americans fought things. We've been through any number of revivals in the history of the United States, over and over again, the rise of Methodism and Baptist, Southern Baptists in the 19th century, tremendous growth. So there's always been this dimension of a certain kind of commitment to basically a Christian anthropology. So another way to put it, in light of my French Revolution comments, the American Revolution took on certain political structures that one could see on the continent and in its conversation with Europe. But it didn't take on the anthropological revolution. It hadn't yet decided that there was no such thing as sin. It hadn't yet decided that the world was perfectible, even though a lot of people were very optimistic about the American experiment and where it was going to go. What this means now as Catholics, and what I want to draw out of this snapshot too, is despite the fact that Catholics experienced a fair bit of anti-Catholicism and persecution in the history of the United States, we are different. Catholics are weird, if you think about it from a Protestant perspective, super uptight about certain sexual issues, yet they drink and gamble and raise money off it. They think calling it bingo makes it okay. We still do that. That despite a fair bit of persecution, a fair bit of fear around Catholics, it was possible for Catholics to, on certain issues and in a certain fundamental perspective, share a view of the human person, of God, of man, with a broader Protestant culture. So there were certain moments when it rhymed, when things seemed to work together. Catholics in the 1920s, 1930s, a typical Catholic parish, everyone had to walk to it, ethnic, clearly be ethnic, and if you've been to any of the old cities, you know how you have 14 parishes within 3 blocks, and they all had a different language for Mass, right? And they had fights over this, by the way. In American Catholic history, the Germans and Irish burning down each other's churches or trying to over whether or not the Mass was going to be celebrated in German or English. Feisty bunch. Us Hispanics are much more mellow about this, I'm just going to tell you. Nonetheless, they reached a point, particularly right after the Second World War, when Catholics had fought side by side with Protestants for the purpose of freedom, properly understood, had fought a tyranny in Europe, were slowly coming into a certain kind of economic predominance, or rising economically. More and more Catholics going on to higher education, largely due to the GI Bill, such that Catholics started looking and seeming more like they could fit in with this American thing. They fought for freedom. They're not that weird after all. They actually speak English, a lot of them. And they started to fit in a particular way. And it was an interesting moment. There was a lot of hopeful talk from Catholics, from one of the great theologians of the 20th century, John Courtney Murray, who said, this is a moment when the America that we love and have fought to defend and our Catholic identity are coming together in a particular way. This is from John Courtney Murray, a theologian writing right after the World War II, from a book, a series of essays. He says, Catholic participation in the American consensus has been full and free, unreserved and unembarrassed, because the contents of this American consensus, the ethical and political principles drawn from the tradition of natural law, approve themselves to the Catholic intelligence and conscience. Where this kind of language is talked, the Catholic joins the conversation with complete ease. Translation, America still has these natural law principles. Catholics speak natural law too. We're all speaking natural law right now. There's actually a convergence of the view of a human person, the good, justice, all these things are coming together. And it was sort of a unique moment around the Civil Rights Movement, it was like a later time, when the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King's leadership of it was really a unique moment. Despite everyone's claim there's been a next civil rights issue in that, historically speaking, the Civil Rights Movement was uniquely ecumenical. It was uniquely ecumenical. Catholics, Protestants. And there was a lot of talk in the 50s and even into the 60s about the way in which America was, the American consensus could fit everybody because we agreed on what a human being was and what justice was and what the good is. Benedict XVI, by the way, himself acknowledges this. In a speech he gave to the bishops of the United States in January of this year, he wrote, or said, at the heart of every culture, whether perceived or not, is a consensus about the nature of reality and the moral good, and thus about the conditions for human flourishing. In America, that consensus, as enshrined in your nation's founding documents, was grounded in a worldview shaped not only by faith, but a commitment to certain ethical principles deriving from nature and nature's God. And he goes on to say, we as Catholics can cooperate, celebrate that even. And it's worth celebrating and cooperating with. So there's this interesting moment where Catholics, despite a whole history of anti-Catholicism, of being experiencing all kinds of persecution, and by the way, Denver was one of the last states in the Union, if not the last cities in the Union. Colorado was the last state in the Union that had anti-Catholic laws on the books. Despite the history of that, there was a moment in American history when it seemed as though the consensus would work. There's a famous book by a guy named Will Herbert called Protestant Catholic Jew that came out, sort of saying, somehow Americans are all making this work. They're fitting together. Snapshot 3, the 1960s. I've given it a subtitle because now you realize how attached I am to long subtitles. From Protestant liberalism to utopic humanitarianism. How's that? Utopic humanitarianism. Utopic from utopia, humanitarianism. That makes sense. What happened in the 1960s, I believe, and I'm resting upon a lot of scholarship on this, is that America itself moved, that it made a cultural shift. This tends to get put under the rubric of the sexual revolution, but it was about a lot more than sex. In the 1960s, shorthand, and I'll go into this in a minute, but here's the shorthand point. The anthropology of the French Revolution was adopted by certain American cultural leaders and has slowly permeated, in particular, the leadership class in our country. So that peace in the French Revolution that wasn't part of the American founding particularly emerged in the 1960s. There's a lot of reasons for this. And I recommend a book by a gentleman I've gotten to know a bit by the name of Ross Douthat. He wrote this recent book, you might have seen it in DCR, called Bad Religion, Why America Became a Country of Heretics. He's a New York Times columnist, so he's into like catchy titles. But a whole section of his book is basically what happened to religion, Protestant and Catholic, after 1950s. What happened? And he's a wonderful, I'm not going to summarize it all, but he's a wonderful sort of account of this. In short, what you could say is, due to a whole set of factors, ideas which had previously been kept at arm's length, except in academia and among a few philosophers in American history, became part of more common culture, particularly in our universities and in our media. There's a lot of reasons for this. One is, frankly, there's technological reasons. The creation of the pill, the invention of the pill, changed the way people related to sex, whether they did it cognitively or not. It changed the way they thought about this act. The electronic media is on the rise in the 1960s. I'm not going to get these stats quite right, so don't quote me on them, but because I used to teach this, I used to know these things. Something in 1948, there were 1% of homes had televisions. By about 1959, it's something like 50%. By 1960, it's way up. The majority, particularly in the cities, everyone had a television. The electronic media is on the rise, and it starts having an influence on the way people think. And what it leads to is the adoption of a different view of the human person. One, that somehow the world is perfectible. I admit, being my age, looking back at the 1960s and seeing things about the age of Aquarius, I know some of you lived through that, seems goofy. I'm an 80s Reagan guy. I'm cynical, and we're always fighting communism, that kind of thing. So everyone's lying, and everyone's a totalitarian. In the 60s, though, there was genuine belief that they were creating a new world, that a certain kind of liberty had broken forth for the human race, and that freedom was expanding, and that self-expression had no limits, and that there was an option now for unfallen humanity to remake the world and to make it perfect. It's not a coincidence that certain European ideological schools of thought gained prominence in American universities in the 1950s and 60s. All kinds of them, not just Marxism, but all kinds of them. And what we see then is the United States, American culture, making a move. And it's leaving the consensus behind. The consensus is what's getting lost. So Catholics finally got allowed into the house. And then we found out everyone else was evacuating it, and it was on fire. Right? We're like, hey, we're here, we can play now. And all of a sudden, the world around us is changing. Again, the line from Justice Kennedy in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. We see a worldview in which self-expression is everything. In a recent talk, Helen Alvarez, who many of you know, at Steubenville University, gave a talk in which she borrowed from a sociologist who she knows well, the term sexuality-ism. Sexuality-ism, which is defined as sexuality, sex, is for the fundamental purpose of self-expression, period. It's not for procreation. It's not even for unitive purposes anymore. It's not even for bonding, as Janice Smith would like to say, bonding and babies. It's for neither. It's simply for identity formation and self-expression. And the notion that self-expression is the highest freedom and should never be limited walks hand in hand with that version of sexuality. And this applies to all kinds of things. Someone should be free to be whoever they want to be. This is in our air, this is in the air we breathe. I was recently down at the courthouse for the debates around civil unions, and needless to say they were very controversial in that I was listening. And of many observations one could make, one observation was the fundamental assumption in that room was just that any kind of limitation of freedom is evil. Fundamentally evil. It's so much that you didn't even have to argue about it. You didn't have to make a debate about it. It was just said. Modern politics is a lot of slogan, and I think slogans on the right and the left are both, I suppose, useful for garnishing votes, but not very useful for clear thinking. And I don't want to make a right or left comment, but slogans tend to hide any kind of clear thinking. And one of the slogans that kept coming up and has been used is, someone has to be free to love whoever they want. Okay, let's just say that's true for a moment. But does that mean you can love anyone you want? Like your brother, or your sister, or your uncle? Well, no. Well, why not? What's the point? Where's the rational distinction between loving whoever you want, which seems like just a plausible argument, and any limits, can you put no limits on that? The interesting thing is not that people disagree over that. That's fine. Humans can disagree on what they want. The interesting thing is that question never came up. No one took it one step further and just said, wait a minute. Freedom for anything? I've often thought this around the abortion issue. The abortion issue which says, which is basically premised on a sort of assumption that's a part of this change of mind in the 60s around issues like, well, it's okay, you can do whatever you want, and you can freely express yourself however you want as long as you don't hurt anybody. Sounds fine. Problem is, the same people who assert that are the same people who get to define what constitutes hurt. And who counts as somebody? Does a baby in the womb count as somebody? And does it count as hurt? A particular action or a different action? This is where morality comes in. Ethics always finds its way in. And so the American consensus broke. Ethical consensus broke. And it shouldn't surprise us that civil wars, frankly, and I don't think that's too strong a word, broke out in most traditional religious communities. Broke out among Catholics, broke out among mainline Protestants. The rise in Protestantism of two camps that had previously existed, fundamentalists and others, but took on a new life after 1960. There was a civil war over the nature of the human person and the nature of the good. Benedict XVI comments, he says, today, this is in the same speech in which he praised the American founding, he says, today, the American consensus has eroded significantly in the face of powerful new cultural currents which are not only directly opposed to core moral teachings of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but increasingly hostile to Christianity as such. There's been a shift. Snapshot 4. So what happened to Catholics? Where were we in all this? It was a tough time for Catholics. World War II marked a significant change. We were finally allowed in. We were included. Heck, we had a Catholic president whose bust was on everybody's mantelpiece, 1 inch larger than the Pope's, I'm told. It seemed like the moment had arrived. The Catholic moment had happened. We fit in. It was fine. Many Catholics marched with Martin Luther King. We're part of the civil rights. Benedict Rochelle was part of that. There was a moment it fit in. Justice was coming. Things were going well. And then the world starts slipping away. The American culture starts taking a turn. And again, this is a gradual process. Pretty quick from historical terms, frankly. But it's moving. And this created a moment of sort of Catholic uneasiness. Ease and uneasiness. In one sense, we were comfortable, we fit in, life was good, we were happy, we didn't want to make waves. In another sense, we started seeing things slip away. 1973 decision to legalize abortion created a real crisis in Catholic identity. In particular, when the Democratic Party, which back then, to be Catholic was to be Democratic, when the Democratic Party picked up abortion as part of its platform. It caused psychic damage in Catholics. I mean, really, it was very confusing. You hear the old joke when one lady says to the other, I think John O'Donnell is not Catholic, or not Catholic, or not, oh no, he's a Republican. She says, that's impossible, I saw him in church. There's a time when that was true. So all of a sudden, now the divide is cutting into some fundamental identity questions for Catholics. And it caused a real psychic dissonance. But I would say this is my hypothesis, and I think I can defend it. The majority of Catholics, though, sought to occupy a space of sort of comfortable silence, distance, ease around this whole issue. Let's not make waves. Let's see, we got our space, we came into the house, let's stay here, let's keep things peaceful. This is true in particular of our institutions. A lot of my work has been, or a lot of my thinking and study has been on the history of Catholic higher education in this country. And a lot of our institutions, no one was asking questions like, how are you handling this? Where do you stand with these issues, sexual revolution and that? Are you taking a stand? It was easy to be for civil rights. It was hard, unfortunately, let's just not talk about that. Let's just not bring it up. We're comfortable, we fit in, let's see if we can't occupy this sort of middle zone. We keep our heads down, we do our thing, and everything goes on well. And I think the majority of Catholics were there, and a lot of our institutions were there. And I think it's fair to say a lot of our bishops weren't concerned about that either. It was sort of it's feel like, I don't even know how to talk about it. It's almost like a cultural agreement that we'll just keep our heads low and keep going. Of course, this ability to occupy some sort of middle space, for American or Catholic, everything's fine, gets harder and harder the more the sexual revolution advances. And the more in our own lifetimes we've seen increasingly radical positions taken on everything from sex to the human person, to eugenics, to moral questions around human life and human dignity. And the ability to sort of hide and stay in some sort of comfortable middle is increasingly gone. By the way, this is not just a Catholic right kind of observation. There's a wonderful, in the year 2000, there's a wonderful back and forth between Cardinal George and Peter Steinfeld. Peter Steinfeld, for those of you know him, brilliant columnist, would consider himself a liberal Catholic. Cardinal George would consider very much on the right of the Catholic thing, for whatever worth these terms are. And they had a back and forth. One of the things Peter Steinfeld said was, I used to have a place to sit. I was a good Catholic, I believed in all these things. There were one or two issues I disagreed with the church on, but I could fit in this middle. And he said, I feel like the culture's left me behind. I can't go where they're going now. I can't occupy both space. And I think one of the things what we're seeing, why religious freedom now, is we've seen the lines being drawn between two fundamentally different worldviews get increasingly separate, and increasingly clear, and increasingly hostile. That's just the reality. And so this middle is gone. And so for a set of us who thought the middle was fine, which seemed fine even 15 years ago, we just sort of thought, it's okay, kind of get along. Yeah, I disagree on this particular issue, or agree on this particular issue. It's not a space we can any longer occupy. And one of the places you see it is in current debates over our Catholic institutions Catholic. Increasing pressure from the broader culture that certain institutions become more like the broader culture. I've seen this in pressure in Catholic Charities, I've seen it in higher education. Hey, look, you guys, you can't keep being freaks like that and have those weird views of the human person and oppressing women and etc. You're downright nefarious. And then a pushback from the bishop saying, are you Catholic or not? Are you with us or not? And so we get this almost, the tragic but almost laughable situation of Kathleen Sebelius speaking at Georgetown, and you kind of go, whatever you feel about the issue, that is really incongruous in a number of ways. That's just odd. Unless you know the history. Unless you know the history and say, well, institutions are going to have to make decisions. You're going to have to choose. And so we've seen the situation that we're in developing over time. I think there's a certain blindness to it or an unwillingness to see it. But now it's in front of us. The dragons have come to the shire. And it might be a good thing. It might be a very good thing. Because it will make for clarity. If, in fact, it also makes some hard decisions, it at least clarifies the issues. I've certainly seen it in charities. If there's ever been an organization, Catholic Charities is one that in many ways we just like to keep its head down and serve the poor. Leave us alone, let's do good things. It's becoming increasingly hard to occupy that space. I can't anymore. I can't. And again, whatever side of a particular issue you're on, there's just no middle. And institutions are being forced to make decisions, as are individual Catholics. Snapshot 5. In the midst of all this, I think we're seeing some changes in American Catholicism that are worthy of note. And I'm calling this one the rise of homegrown Catholicism. Homegrown Catholicism. By which I mean that for the first time in the history of this country, we've got a couple generations of Catholics who've known nothing but the United States of America, who speak English, and as American as anyone else culturally. They're just part of it. These are the youth advocates we're dealing with often. It's a different kind of entity. Catholicism has always been ethnic and somewhat foreign. Now it's not. Now we've got a generation of young people, maybe 2 generations, who are completely American and completely Catholic. It's a different dynamic. We're not foreigners anymore. And in a certain sense, this country is as much ours as Catholics as it is ours as Americans as it is ours. And so we're getting these interesting issues over American and Catholic identity. We've seen the breaking down of ethnic communities. You can no longer tell one's faith by their last name. You can't tell their faith by political affiliation anymore. That's dynamic 1. Dynamic 2 under this, lots of people have left the church, left the Catholic Church. About 1/3 of Catholics have left the Catholic Church in the United States. Interestingly enough, people make big noise out of this in this recent conference in Florida about how the Catholic Church is losing all its 20-somethings. Well, interestingly enough, as mainline religion in America goes, losing only 1/3 of your members is actually on the low side. Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups are losing half their members, 2/3 of their members. There's just a changing religious landscape that I think is a broader question. Also, a lot of the Catholics who are leaving the Catholic faith in the United States are becoming evangelicals. So it's not like they're rejecting a certain kind of orthodoxy or commitment to Christ. They're just not finding it in the Catholic Church. And that's a whole other topic we can talk about. But the point is, it's not a rejection of certain traditional Christianity. In fact, what they're doing is saying, many of them are saying, I'm finding this somewhere else, which is an interesting dynamic. So many Catholics are leaving the church, nonetheless, with the blessing of many of our Hispanic brothers and sisters. The overall number of Catholics in the United States still remains about 22% of the American population. Third thing to note, just a sidelight related to that. We often get the perception of the U.S., oh no, what's happening to the church, everything's doomed, why doesn't the Pope do something? 2 things to remember, 6% of Catholics in the world live in the United States. I know we think that number's closer to 96%. Only 6% of them are here. If the Pope's distracted on some other countries, that's with good reason. The second thing to note is, around the world, Catholicism is growing. It continues to grow. In the words of John Allen, the last half-century witnessed the greatest period of missionary expansion in the 2,000-year history of Catholicism, fueled by explosive growth in the southern hemisphere. Huge numbers of people are becoming Catholic around the world. So while things are shifting, it's not like some other faith is simply dying. Next subpoint. Because the lines have been starkly drawn, we're seeing a different dynamic among Catholic youth. And this I speak to from personal experience, dealing mainly with college students, but also with some high school students. To be 20 and faced with the decision of being a Catholic or not is a much clearer decision today than it was 20 years ago. Because there's no reason to be a Catholic unless you really want to be a Catholic. With the way demographics are working, the way trends are working, the way just culturally the world is, it's no big deal. 25 years ago, when I was a kid, if I had told my mom I decided not to be a Catholic, there would have been rending of garments and great agony and suffering. And I would have expected, I just wouldn't imagine doing it. Today, it's the freedom of choice around this issue has allowed that people are selecting in or out. There's no reason to choose the Catholic faith, really, unless, or any Christian version of Christianity, by the way, unless you really need it. What this has done, and in my own experience and in some of my own work, and certainly the movement, the Christian life movement has seen this as well around the world, let alone in their work in the States, is there's a rising generation of young Catholics, not a huge number, who are completely committed to the faith. And they're not fighting the same battles of 20 years ago. So one of the sort of classic divides in what I call maybe a little bit exaggeratedly the Civil War in the Catholic Church, one of the sort of dividing lines was always there were what were called social justice Catholics and there were pro-life Catholics. That was just sort of a history of the sort of Catholic thing. There's reasons for that and things to say about it. What you can say about this rising generation, my experience, they love Jesus, they love babies, they love the unborn, they love the poor, they want to do it all. If they're in, they're in. And it's not a dividing line for them in the same way. And I think this is a very hopeful thing. For those of you who look at me, and I know the question on your mind is, yeah, but how many of them are there really? I don't know. I've had the privilege of being with a lot of young people in this place and speaking to them. But I will say this, I think we want to keep in mind Benedict XVI's dictum, never despise small beginnings. As a historian, I can tell you this, history is moved and changed by small numbers of people, not by masses. Occasionally the mass kicks up, they do something, but they lose their energy. They're only good for about 3 days of slaughter or something. People are driving it. People are moving it, and that's small numbers. The early church is testimony to this, that Christ can do great things with a faithful 10. All of this means, these things together, that the feel of Catholicism today is different than it's been in the last 30 years. There are a lot of different dynamics. I'm part of a group called the Catholic Association of Latino Leaders, and we're having a lot of conversations around what does it mean, the number of Hispanics? What does it mean that half the American Catholic Church will probably be Hispanic in 15 years? What's the implications of that? There's a lot that we don't know, and a lot we're trying to think through. But it's different. There's a very different feeling. But I would say it's not an unhopeful one. It's not an unhopeful one. Number 6. The current issue of religious freedom. So I said I talked about religious freedom. I finally got there. We need to locate the current debates, attacks, and developments around religious freedom in this broader narrative. What I would say what we're witnessing is a particular version of what a human being is, an anthropological vision conflicting with another one. We're seeing the American consensus around a certain sense of natural law and that being attacked by a different and very influential view of the human person, which is fundamentally opposed to it. And it shouldn't surprise us that it finds us in a million ways. I mean, frankly, the religious freedom debate issue is, I would say, less threatening than the fact that for about 30 or 20 years the media has been pumping false views of the human being into our children. It's actually had more detrimental effect. That's why we're where we are today. So as much as we want to get excited about religious freedom because it's there, it's tangible, it's visible, it strikes at the Constitution in sort of an obvious way, the erosion, the attack, the conflict of these two views has been going on for a very long time. Second thing I'd say to us is, while religious freedom is of great importance, it is not of primary importance. And I think we can sometimes forget this. The church has been persecuted throughout its history. Good estimates from secular organizations would say that since the year 2000, about 150,000 Catholics around the world are killed for their faith every year, right now. They estimate 1.2 million Christians have been killed around the world right now, persecution. 2/3 of the nations, of the countries of our current world have been identified as persecuting Christians by third-party organizations. This is one of the less cited promises of Christ in the gospel. If you follow me, the world will treat you the way it treated me. So in a certain sense, there should be a ton of surprise. Hey, if you believe our Savior, this is what he said would happen. And as we're going, it's going on right now. It isn't like all of a sudden religious persecution came out of nowhere. And if you know some history, French Revolution, this nice movie out about Mexico, the Cristero Revolution, Cristero Rebellion, which I taught, studied a fair bit and taught at Christendom colleges, and a fascinating moment. It happened in Spain, it's happening in countries all over the world. We see persecution. So while persecution is of great importance and we need to fight for religious freedom, and I'm going to talk about how we do that and things like that, it isn't the most fundamental thing. The most fundamental thing is that Christians be Christians and that Catholics be Catholics. And what we're really fighting for are the minds and hearts of ourselves and of our children, and we need to do that first. And here's the key piece of the argument. If we do that, we stand a chance not only of dying boldly screaming Viva Cristo Rey, but may be affecting the historical tide. I am not convinced, despite these attacks and despite the media and the many things that can make us worried, that the game is lost or something. In the end, the victory is Christ's. And it may be that there's a moment now for those who continue to believe in natural law, who continue to live by an anthropology that was in the founding of the American thing, that goes much deeper and further back, and Catholics in particular who are armed with an explanation and a defense of those truths that goes way back, and is philosophical as well as theological. But there might be a moment precisely now for a Catholic voice, if it's clear, if it's faithful, and if it's true. As a historian, I can tell you the greatest dangers to the church come from the inside. Heresy and the sins of its own people. That's what real danger is. Outside attacks, they're pretty dangerous. They're not pleasant. In some cases, they lead to flourishing of the faith. If we can avoid the internal ones, we're in much better shape. So while I am very much motivated by the current assault on religious freedom, I want us to remember it's not the only thing. It's not the only thing. And it may provide us with an opportunity. If we avoid two pitfalls. The first one is despair. It's all over. We knew this was coming. There's no way. You hear people talk about the upcoming election on that, from both sides. Would you reverse the advances of the last 4 years and send us to ruin? If this guy gets reelected, it's the apocalypse. And we're at a key moment. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm trying to play down the issues that are being debated right now. But when you view the world that way, you can become pretty inactive or pretty desperate. You can hide. You can be somewhat spaz. You can act unthinkingly, or you can act only at the moment. And my argument is, if we're going to seize what may be a Catholic moment, we need to think of a strategy that's longer than this coming November. Not that it doesn't include those. For my political friends out there going, Reyes, what are you saying? It includes that. Second pitfall, fear. Fear. If Christians stay silent, we will lose. There will be no Catholic moment. There may not be one anyway, I'll be honest, but there ain't a chance for one if we stay silent. And fear governs public conversation. The fear of condemnation, the fear of ridicule, the fear of being accused of being something. We can't let fear dominate. I mean, this is where I think there was something prophetic in John Paul II in his constant call to be not afraid. We have to speak. Because for our own sakes and for the sake of the world around us. So let's not panic. Let's not be shocked. Let's not be fearful. And let's not despair. Seventh point, the last one. Those of you who are dying. My good friend Joe Burns over there looking at those cookies. So what is the place of American Catholicism in the future? This is pure subjective opinion on my part. Some thoughts. I've alluded to these, but I want to end with this. I want to give you a somewhat longish quotation from Benedict XVI. Bear with me. I know this is being recorded, and so I want to make sure this gets on there. So you just know I'm not making it up. This is Benedict XVI, who I think has suffered his fair share of abuse, has seen horrific things inside the church as well as outside, has probably a perspective of great breadth on the persecution of Christians around the world. So if there's a man who has reason to despair, worry, be anxious, it's Benedict XVI. And here's his words to us. With her, the church's, long tradition of respect for the right relationship between faith and reason, the church has a critical role to play in countering cultural trends which, on the basis of an extreme individualism, seek to promote notions of freedom detached from moral truth. Our tradition does not speak from blind faith, but from a rational perspective, which links our commitment to building an authentically just, humane, and prosperous society to our ultimate assurance that the cosmos is possessed of an inner logic, accessible to human reason. The Church's defense of a moral reasoning based on natural law is grounded on her conviction that His law is not a threat to our freedom, but rather a language which enables us to understand ourselves and the truth of our being, and so to shape a more just and human world. She thus proposes her moral teaching as a message not of constraint, but of liberation, and as the basis for building a secure future, end quote. Benedict XVI's advice: continue with reason to articulate a vision of the human person and a vision of the cosmos that's rational and liberating. I don't think it's that hard in one sense. I don't think it's that hard to understand. My experience with young people is they actually get this. As much as it seems weird, as soon as you say things like natural law or nature, I noticed this, by the way, in the civil unions debate, no one used those terms, probably wisely. They wouldn't get to hear it. It's like you're not allowed to say those kinds of things. I'm noticing young people, there's some interesting stats. I mean, one of the recent study of young people was asking, what's the most important thing to you in the world? Of all your future, you look at your future, what's your top goal? The majority of teenagers from no particular faith said the most important thing to them was a lifelong marriage. Built into the human heart is a desire for certain goods, and we can continue to appeal to those. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Thank the Lord. Because He put them in there. In the human being is a desire for God. And we can continue to appeal to that because it's in there. No matter how suppressed, no matter how hidden, no matter how fought with by the culture. So I think we have a moment, and I think we have a mandate from Benedict XVI, not only to fight unjust law, which we must do, not only to participate in the political process in terms of voting and opinion making, which we must do, not only to make sure that we ourselves are well informed, that others know what's going on in the current political issues, that's true, but fundamentally to actually understand our own tradition, because it may be the only voice of reason left in much of the world. I believe it is a Catholic goal. So what do? 4 things that I would just... Number one, we have to have a political response. I'll just point out to you, every revolution or every time that Catholics are persecuted in the Western world, it starts by changing laws. You change laws first. Always. Laws matter. They teach, they affect. We've got to worry about the law. So we've got to be engaged. Silence is not an option, and neither is accommodation. I mean, this is a question that's a tough one. It sounds. When do you just sort of say, well, I can live with that, and when do you push back? It's actually prudential decisions there that are pretty tough. But we have to have a political response. Second response, we have to know what the heck we're talking about. Are we formed in the faith? Do we actually know why we defend marriage? Why we defend what a human being is? Do we know our own history? Do we know enough to actually be able to not just convince others, but ourselves? I'm not just following this because I'm told I have to, which I may do anyway, but I need to actually understand it. So our own formation, and our children, The other thing you'll note is in cultural revolutions, the institutions that get co-opted first by those who would like to launch a revolution are the institutions of education. You want to change your world? Change its education system. And we have to think about our own formation and the education of our children and our institutions of education. Third, we need to be willing to preach the gospel. We need to be fearless in being able to tell people about Jesus Christ. We need to be wise, we need to be prudent, we need to not be obnoxious, but we need to be ready to do it and prepared to do it. And fourth, we need to evangelize not just our neighbor, but using a term from Paul VI, we need to evangelize our culture, ultimately. We need to actually think about institutions that make culture, higher education, politics, charities, that influence the way a culture goes, the media. And we need to be creative and thoughtful about ways we can engage here. One of the funnest things about dealing with young people is they got a million ideas for how they can start a ministry that changes this, or fundamentally makes a difference here. And while some of those ideas lack a certain kind of experiential wisdom, the verve and the energy behind them is actually quite hopeful. They're actually viewing the world. You know, I can just do picture these 12 apostles, 11, then 12, sitting in an upper room, finally getting over their fear. Holy Spirit's touched them. You just see them looking out going, okay, we're going to go conquer the world now. A slightly implausible vision unless God himself is on your team. And I think we don't want to lose that. There's an evangelization of culture element that's in front of us. It's an interesting time. It's a momentous time. And it's the time that you and I have been made for. You're alive now precisely for this time. And if what I've said is true, it may be a moment, it may be an opportunity. And may God give us the grace to rise to it. Thank you.